Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Clare, Boothe, Luce Policy Institute. And I want to thank you all for coming today and welcome you to our first CWN, Conservative Women Network Lunch of 2015. I also want to give a special thanks to our CWN co-host, Becky Norton Dunlop, our partner in these luncheons for many, many years. It's always a pleasure to be here and work with the fine people at the Heritage Foundation. Now I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Luce Nelson is CEO of the American Legislative Exchange Council, known as ALEC. ALEC is the largest nonpartisan voluntary membership organization of state legislators dedicated to the principles of limited government, free markets, and federalism. And Luce is going to give us her take on what's happening in the state houses this year in light of the November elections. Before joining ALEC, Luce was the managing partner of Ulysses Consulting, where she specialized in legislative and regulatory efforts, government and corporate relations, and PAC management. In 3 decades of legislative strategy, she's considered a leader in understanding the need for grassroots and third-party support for an effective agenda. From 2005 to 2013, Luce was with Visa, Inc., the credit card, and served as head of the government relations for the Americas. Over the course of 8 years, Luce built the global government function for Visa, which grew from a very small domestic division to an integrated multinational function. Prior to joining Visa, Luce was Senior Vice President of External Relations at AOL Time Warner, where she oversaw relationships with all external policy organizations. Additionally, Luce served as Public Affairs Liaison for the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, from 1995 to 1998, and she actually got started in working for President Reagan. She came to Washington after she graduated from Berkeley in 1983 and worked for Reagan for president here in DC, and you never left, right?
That's right. I tried, but I came back.
Luce is a political science and international relations graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, and she and her husband live in McLean and have 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Luce Nelson.
Thank you. I know what you're thinking. How does a girl who graduates from Berkeley, California, end up here speaking in front of the Conservative Women's Network at the Heritage Foundation? It's just crazy. Interestingly enough, I was kind of termed a Reagan baby. So there was a lot of us who grew up in California with Reagan as governor and then watched him kind of move to DC, and I was determined to kind of come and follow him. So that was back in 1983. How many of you were active in politics in 1983 or during the Reagan years? Good. I thought I saw a few of my my fellow folks. Thank you very much to the Clare Boothe Luce Institute and for organizing this event, and thank you to Becky at the Heritage Foundation for hosting this. This is a great honor to be with all of you, and just an interesting group that I really hadn't known much about, so I'm really thrilled to learn a bit more. Clare Boothe Luce was an amazing woman, and I know you know that because you founded it 21 years ago, but should be an inspiration to all of us. During her life, she served as a congresswoman, ambassador to Italy, and member of several presidents' international and foreign intelligence advisory boards for Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. She was a skilled writer and editor who was not afraid of adversity, which I'm sure many of you here would call yourselves the same way. She was also the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is a high, high honor. She broke through barriers so that we can now all have the jobs that we have. And, as you introduce me as the CEO, ALEC never had a CEO before, and when I took the job, they moved it from an executive director to a CEO position, which I felt was really important for a woman. I don't think there had been a woman that had run ALEC before, maybe Lori Roman for a year or so. But, those kinds of things are optically very important, so something that I really thank ALEC for doing, so that means a lot. Just a quick intro on Alec, and you described it very well. But for me, it's kind of full circle. I came here in '83 to work for Reagan, as Michelle said. I did have a little brief stint in New York when my husband was at business school in Columbia and worked for National Review magazine. So I got to work for William F. Buckley, which was absolutely fantastic. And it was there that I met Newt Gingrich. And he asked me in 1993, would you come back to Washington? I was pregnant at the time, and run this organization called GOPAC. It was a little state legislative farm team building organization, and he was convinced that the next year, 1994, that the Republicans were going to take over the House for the first time in 40 years. And I thought, why not roll the dice? We'll move back to Washington. And it turned out to be a pretty significant gambit because we did win for the first time in 40 years, moving state legislators up through the ranks, identifying 72 new freshmen who got elected that year. So it was very exciting, much like the numbers that we saw just this last November. But that's kind of a full circle. You mentioned my corporate background, which is very helpful as you get into policy work and things like that. But really getting back to that state legislative farm team grassroots element is what I'm enjoying about Alex. So really, really fun. We have about 2,000 nonpartisan, but primarily Republican, but nonpartisan legislative members out of the 7,000 across the country. And we are focused on developing model policy. So it's kind of a bottom-up organization that legislators bring to us and our 9 task forces policy in different areas, whether it's healthcare, whether it's tax reform, whether it's education. We develop the policy with our membership, and then it moves through and becomes actual signed-off model policy from ALEC. Many of those bills end up becoming law, as you can imagine. So we're very proud of that and look forward to this year really pursuing that a lot more. Just to set the stage, and I think Michelle kind of alluded to this, up for election in this last November, 82% of the country's legislators were up for re-election. So it's the senators that are off and some of the off-camera. I think on the off years in 2015, it's New Jersey, Mississippi, and Virginia who will have our elections or their elections in 15. But the results of that election actually flipped 11 chambers in favor of Republicans. Republicans control both chambers in 31 states, so that's both the Senate and the House in 31 states, which also includes the unicameral Nebraska, which does not delineate party lines. Democrats control both chambers in just 11 states. So, and outside, I think Molly put maps of that breakdown and the ratios and how many and who are in each of those chambers. If you're kind of a political junkie, it's a fun thing to have in your desk drawer to kind of refer to when you're thinking about targeting states, if you're thinking about grassroots efforts, if you're just interested in what's the breakdown in the states. So GOP have the trifecta in 23, which is the governor's mansion and the Senate and the House. And the Democrats have that same trifecta in 13. So as you work in your areas of expertise and think through, kind of what are we going to get accomplished in 15 and 16, remember that you can target those states that really are controlled if it's a free market principled kind of issue agenda that you're working on. More women hold legislative office in the state and federal levels than any other time in history. So as a women's group, I think that's really important. I was involved in several of the races here at the federal level with Barbara Comstock and Elise Stefanik and Joni Ernst and everybody. So really exciting to see that kind of success. In that election, I think it's really important to note, and in fact, today in the Wall Street Journal, Steve Moore, who is the Heritage chief economist, wrote about this, and he's actually echoing what Alec has been talking about. Tax reform is a big, big issue. 14 states cut taxes last year, and it's not just the red states. So a common kind of misperception is that there aren't Democrats out there that are cutting taxes. In the states, they realize that that's the only way they're going to get reelected if they've got an election coming up. So in 14 states, they cut taxes. I'd say about half of those were the blue states and half were red. Our predictions, and it was echoed again in Steve Moore's article today, that our prediction is that 15 states will cut taxes in 2015, or at least 15, possibly even 20. And that's because in an off-year election, you're more likely to see a lot more activity in that first year before they're kind of going back to their re-elections. So that's one thing that I think needs to just be recognized and should resonate in all of our messaging, that cutting taxes really was a way to get reelected and get recognized for your efforts. Obamacare and similar big government policies were a big concern to people, and it's no surprise. That's what all the ads were and everything else. But it's important to note Colorado's legislature flipped both chambers after 500,000 Coloradans lost their private health care insurance. So it turned out to be a big issue in specific states. So Cory Gardner certainly benefited from that, and clearly a lot of the congressional races did. Denver experienced a 26% increase in their health insurance rates, which are now the country's fourth highest healthcare rates. So it's, I think the message here is that these decisions obviously have consequences, and not only consequences immediately, but then resonate in the election results. America made it clear they want a functioning government that empowers people and protects them from government overreach and government intervention. So I want to take a few minutes to kind of lay out what I think and what ALEC believes are the key 8 ideas for kind of opportunity in legislation in the states. The first is cutting the red tape. And it's not anything new, but a few examples: government should be efficient, effective, accountable, and encourage entrepreneurship and free enterprise in their state decision-making policies. The federal government, as we all know, is holding back innovation. For that reason, I have announced in our December meeting a new Center of Innovation and Technology at ALEC, where we're going to be focusing on new entrepreneurial, innovative ideas to cut the red tape, make government more efficient. Actually, Newt Gingrich has a book called Breakout that if you are really into this stuff, you might want to read. It's basically kind of a prescription for each policy area, how you could think of new technological breakthroughs and breakout decisions. Some of the examples that we're using at ALEC is where Iowa and Delaware have just recently transitioned their driver's licenses onto your cell phone. Now, of course, there's privacy issues there, so there's going to be some, back and forth and debate. But the idea is, why do we all have to go to the DMV every 7 years and stand in those lines when you could probably either take a test online or figure out some technological way to make that more efficient? Government gets in the way. I don't know if you've heard of that company, 23andMe, a very kind of edgy company out of Palo Alto, California, that was doing genetic testing. And my daughter, who's 20 years old, said, I want to know who I am. I want to, take this. So for Christmas a year ago, we gave it to her. By the time she was able to kind of do the test, the government had shut down 23andMe and restricted what it could do. Which was really frustrating because these kinds of innovations are just groundbreaking and very exciting. The IRS should not be handling forms by hand and losing emails. We're all watching that on TV. It's just amazing that you could lose emails. I'm looking out, many of you are in the generation where that's all you've got. You don't have paper files in your drawers anymore. So cities and states continue to place limits on new technologies like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb. So all of these new innovations that are coming out, these organizations are coming to ALEC and saying, help us navigate this kind of labyrinth of government regulation at the state level. And we want to cut that red tape. Lawmakers should embrace innovation, not discourage it. Our view is permissionless innovation is the way of the future. The second area, I think, is simplifying the tax code. I know that that's a huge core area that Heritage works on as well. People are voting with their feet. We use the example of U-Haul, the company, the moving van company. Actually, Steve Moore actually used it in his article, so we were glad to see that. If you want to move from Austin, Texas to Los Angeles, the moving van costs you $680. If you want to move from Los Angeles to Austin, it costs you $1,548. If you go online, that is the difference. So what does that tell us? What is the reason? That's supply and demand. There's a huge demand for moving vans, taking people out of California, my home state, and bringing them into places like Texas, where both of my kids now go to school. So that's just a great example and visual of really what's wrong and kind of how we're living in this upside down world. Over the last few years, large tax reforms in Indiana and North Carolina and Michigan have stimulated job creation in those states and grown their economies. As I said earlier, this is bipartisan. Republicans really, they are leaders on tax reform, but we should recognize that there are Democrats out there that are trying to cut taxes and do their best, especially at the gubernatorial level. So as much encouragement as we can give to those Democrat state legislators, I think we should. So additionally, the census data kind of backs this up. The U-Haul example is great, but census data show that people are moving to states where the cost of living is lower. States from Pennsylvania to Maine had 141 House members in 1950. Now, that same region has 85 House members. That's a decrease. So every 10 years you have your census and they redraw the maps. It's redistricting is the big boogeyman in the room. They come around every 10 years and draw the maps. Last year, after 2010, we saw California lose 2 congressional districts. Texas picked up 1. Actually, New York lost 1, California lost 1, and Texas picked up 2. So that's another kind of just real life example of what's happening and how people are moving with their feet. States actually collect more tax revenue when they broaden the base and lower the rates. It's well documented in our book, Rich States, Poor States, which we co-author with Steve Moore and Art Laffer. We're in our 6th edition now. Is that right? 6? So for 6 years, we've been tracking this information, and it ranks the states, and the states actually wait for that book to come out every year so that they can kind of see where they are. And you won't be surprised by any of the results. Texas, Virginia, all at the top of the list. New York, California, very near the bottom. From 2001 to 2011, the 9 states with no personal income tax actually grew revenue by 82%. While the 9 states with the highest personal income tax grew revenue by 54%. That's a big difference, and it should show that if you are raising or lowering taxes, you can bring in that money. In addition to tax reform, pension reform should also be included in that kind of fiscal policy discussion. We need to keep the promise for our retirees, because I'm going to be one very soon, while planning for a responsible future. Moving from defined benefit to defined contribution plans help balances the budget. And that's something that ALEC has put forward in model legislation. Cities like Stockton, California, and Detroit, Michigan are great examples of what's happening. They're going bankrupt due to these unfunded pensions. So they're spending all their time kind of digging out, and that's a big problem. Oklahoma is a great example of a state pension reform bill legislation, and should be a model. If you're looking into that issue or working on that issue, you should look to see what Oklahoma did. Third, hold the federal budget accountable. It's called balancing your checkbook, balancing the budget. When I worked for Newt, we gave President Clinton 3 years of balanced budgets for him to sign into law. I don't think I need to talk about the last 8 years. I don't even think we had a budget like in 10 or 11 or 12, which is really upsetting. And when you think about it, all of the states, 49 of the states, have a constitutional amendment that requires them to balance their budget. The only state that doesn't have a constitutional amendment is Vermont, but they balance their budget every year. So all of the states balance their budget every year. I don't know why we can't do it here in Washington. I get that we have, expenditures in foreign policy and things like that pop up, but we should be able to kind of, when you're forecasting in a corporation, you forecast for the inevitable emergency or problem that could arise. So one thing that we're seeing a lot of right now, and I'm sure you're seeing it on TV, is just this notion of the balanced budget amendment and the process that's going forward. There are 24 states who actually have legislation in place that supports an Article 5 convention of the states. John Kasich was just out all over North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Utah, Virginia, talking about a balanced budget. So I think that's a big issue that's coming down the pike. I don't know that you're going to have a convention of the states, because I think once that pressure and the momentum builds, Congress will say, let's fix this, or we hope that they'll say that. But it's really good to build that pressure and to show momentum from the state level. It's really important for the states to show we have skin in this game too, and we're going to show you how to do this. Fourth, reform the criminal justice system. I'm halfway through, so hold on. This is a great example of ALEC working across party lines, and I'm really proud of the work we're doing here. Our focus is to prioritize criminal justice spending, which means, does the punishment fit the crime? And this is an area where, I do remember sitting in meetings maybe 10 years ago or longer than that saying, 3 strikes, you're out. Yeah, that's a good idea. Well, it turns out maybe it wasn't such a good idea, because as states like Colorado are legalizing marijuana, you can't really say that in other states that, you should be in jail for 5 years if you have some variation on a theme. So, we want to make sure that we reform laws that make everyday citizens turn into criminals, and make sure that we recognize the difference. ALEC has a safety valve model policy, which permits judges to depart from those mandatory minimums in sentencing in certain cases of nonviolent offenders. So it gives a little leniency to the judge. It allows for judicial discretion and will lead to taxpayer savings in the long run. Due to groundbreaking work, I think, at Heritage and others, Ohio, again, passed a bipartisan law in December that will help stem the tide of that over-criminalization. And I do sense that issue is going to be kind of talked about as we get into the presidential as well. You're starting to see a lot of folks pay attention to it on the Hill. We need to reward convicted criminals for complying with probation and look at parole terms and make sure that we're actually, evaluating the situation accordingly and not holding people in prisons that could be matriculated out and given some supervision in another way. North Carolina's Justice Reinvestment Act is another model for states. From 2011 to 2014, North Carolina closed down 10 prisons, which is projected to save them $48 million in 2014 alone. Crime rate in North Carolina, as a result of that, has actually fallen 11%. So it kind of shows, and it's an interesting issue, not without a lot of debate and discussion, but it does show that if you respect the individual and try to work through the system, that you can actually save money and get people out of prisons. Fifth, create a workforce-ready students. So this is where education comes in. Global test scores reveal American students are ranking 36th in the world among all of our international peers when it comes to math, reading, and science. Our students are woefully underprepared to compete in today's global economy. Shanghai students in China rank the highest. National test scores show that our 4th and 8th grade students are still lagging in their math and reading skills, which clearly has to be fixed. Throwing money at the problem does not work. Choice does. We support all types of education choice. I know we're still in the week of School Choice Week, which we're all very actively involved in supporting, so that's very exciting. In Washington, D.C. alone, there's 24,000 students right now on waiting lists to get into charter schools. So why is there a waiting list like that just right here in D.C.? Because the statistics are out. If you go to a charter school, 90% of those students are going on to college. If you go to a public school, the statistic of going to college is 26%. That is remarkable, and as a mother who has 2 kids in college, it really hits home when you think through what's out there for our future generations. There are countries that are spending less on education and higher test scores than American students, like Canada, so money clearly isn't the answer. Parents should have the freedom to choose those schools and the teaching methods that best prepare their students. They know their students or their children more than anyone, so they should be able to figure that out. Legislators should not let politics get in the way of sound education policy. Many of the states are experimenting with different types of education and freedom methods. Arizona and Florida have the first educational savings accounts, ESAs, and are seeing positive results thanks to more freedom for parents to choose the schools that their child is going to attend. 42 states and the District of Columbia now allow teachers and communities to create those charter schools that we talked about. Online learning is another opportunity, and those are just great options for different states with more rural situations. Education should be child-centered, and states should do everything in their power to prepare students for financial and intellectual success. STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math, is really critical. The curriculum is the future of excellence in education, and my daughter, who's an engineering major in the engineering school down at SMU, is just a perfect example of that. She got into a really great math and science class in 7th and 8th grade, and it changed the direction of her life. She was focused on history and English, and while she loves that, she really was able to kind of move forward in that STEM. So that early education really makes a difference and sets the stage. Speaking of STEM, my 6th issue for the states is to encourage energy production. We need to make sure that there's access to affordable, reliable, and safe energy that drives the American economy. The good news is America is now energy independent. I don't think the media talks about that enough. They haven't really recognized it. The frustrating news is that government at all levels is trying to block that independence by blocking innovation in energy and natural resource development. Take hydraulic fracking as an example. You've got New York State, who just banned, or I guess in 2014, banned fracking in the entire state. You had an episode just in this last November in Denton, Texas, of all places, that banned fracking just in a locality. So these are some of the issues that we're seeing develop up that are going to be problematic. And when you see that North Dakota, their whole energy boom and all the jobs that are being created are because of that fracking and that hydraulic drilling, and making sure that it's safe, reliable, and successful for good-paying jobs is the most important thing to focus on. It's true that state legislators should be prudent when weighing the economic and environmental costs of this energy development, and we can spend all day arguing kind of culpability of climate change, but the fact of the matter is, we need to plan for it. We need to plan for it, and we need to manage it. 7th, and moving on to healthcare, just encouraging innovation in healthcare. So this goes back to our Center on Innovation and Technology. Believe it or not, there was no such thing as a BlackBerry before 1998. I just went back, I was working for Newt, and we had a little thing, it was actually a pager that we had here, and you could page just the people on your staff. You couldn't talk to anyone else. And then, a couple years later, you got the actual BlackBerry, 1998. Yet everyone in this room, and the majority of low-income adults, all now have a smartphone. And in fact, globally, when I was working at Visa, the statistics were so amazing. Nobody in certain continents had a bank account, and yet they all had a smartphone. So the whole idea was to think, how can you do your banking on your phone? How can we develop things, P2P, person-to-person payments on your phone if you don't have a bank account? How can you get paid if you're a farm worker by digitally downloading that money? It's a great story to tell. It's something that's really important in kind of the evolution of financial management. Imagine if we had experienced the same kind of innovation in healthcare over the past decades as we experienced in telecom and IT. Fortunately, healthcare and IT are converging more than ever, and breakthroughs in that telemedicine are delivering greater access at lower costs, transcending state lines, and presenting really great new opportunities. Telemedicine is bringing patients closer to doctors and vice versa. Recently, Rite Aid just announced a pilot program to offer private high-definition video conferencing kiosks at their select retail locations for patients to interact with doctors right there. Services like Doctors on Demand and MD Live are now allowing patients with smartphones to connect with their doctors 24/7, which is a lot less cost than urgent care. Apps on your smartphone are now linked to thermometers, inhalers, glucose meters, and even a peel and stick Band-Aid, like a vital sign monitor that captures all of your different heart rates and things. Those are phenomenal new kind of inventions and innovations that people are going to be using in the future. We need to protect these market solutions when and where they arise. The free market did not exist before the ACA. And it certainly does not exist now. But there are bright spots that we see and the power of the market at work. A great example is direct care. What happens when you remove insurance from the mix entirely and patients just arrange to pay doctors just directly for their services? Well, prices for surgery in some cases are just 10% of what a hospital would charge the insurance company. Just imagine that. 5 minutes, okay. For others, it's cheaper to pay a doctor for services than it is to meet the deductible. So there's all kinds of things going on in your healthcare now that I think this year and the next few years are going to be kind of experimental to see what works, what makes the most sense with the new Affordable Care Act. Without a government mandate, providers are increasingly making their prices available online to attract new patients, so that we're injecting competition into that marketplace. That's a great pressure to apply to make sure that people understand what I'm getting for my money. There really wasn't any kind of attributable financial connection to the service that you get and what you pay, because you never, if you didn't see the bill, you never knew what it meant. And lastly, I think I know this is an issue near and dear to Heritage's heart, respect worker freedom. So right to work issues. Nothing is more anti-freedom than forcing a person to pay a dues to a union that they did not elect to join. 24 states have right to work policies, and municipalities, again, importantly, are taking up this fight. We've just seen in the last month Kentucky pass in 5 different municipalities right to work laws. Now, what's happening there, it's a little bit of a political game. The legislature hasn't passed that right to work law, so they're bubbling it up from the grassroots and going to force their legislature to pass it. It's really exciting to see, and again, it kind of proves that devolution of power and states' rights, and it works. From 2003 to 2013, right-to-work states enjoyed a job rate of 8.6%, which is more than double of the growth rate in the states that were union and forced union states. That's a really important number to keep in mind and to use when you're in a debate with somebody. When Indiana right-to-work legislation came into effect in 2012, factory payroll employment grew 9.4%. Even union leaders believe that right-to-work works and helps create better unions. We were very delighted to see the quote from 2014, a guy named Gary Castile, Southern Regional Director for the United Auto Workers, said in the Washington Post, "People think right-to-work hurts the unions. To me, it helps them. You don't have to belong if you don't want to." So hopefully people are starting to understand that individual opt-in actually could create a stronger environment. On right to work, I think that my closing line would be that right to work is not anti-worker, it's anti-force. So in conclusion, on these eight kind of broad themes, I think it's important to recognize that freedom for families and individuals is really a key component of that. Freedom from the archaic forms of government that waste time and hard-earned money. The American people deserve a government that is efficient, effective, and accountable. And at ALEC, we've got, I think, 700 model policies that really work to address exactly that in all of these areas. Just a minute on women's issues. I see some men, so don't take offense. I love my husband. He is awesome. But I'm here to talk to you not just as the CEO of ALEC, but also as a woman and a mother with a conservative background, a conservative woman who raised her kids while working for Newt Gingrich. Talk about crazy. What I have learned is that the world needs more strong women leaders. It's really critical that we get out there. I attended a seminar over at the RNC, I guess a week or so ago. It's called 3 to 1. Maybe some of you were there. And what they said there was, for a woman to decide to run for office, you have to ask her 12 times. 12 times. So you're working in your precinct, you're sitting around that table, you're eating your pizza with all the other, volunteer workers. You ask a man and he says, yes, the first time. I'll run. Yeah, I'll run. For a woman, you have to ask her 12 times, because what happens in that time frame is she says, well, okay, if I did this, what would happen with the kids and the, what would happen with, balancing the budget and writing the checks? How would I manage this versus that? So it's a really interesting phenomenon and something that we need to recognize as we consider talking to more women about running for office. We offer a unique perspective that's not often always heard, and we should not limit ourselves to the traditional women's issues that I think some on the left might want to kind of box us into. You all can be champions of all the policies I just talked about, and in fact, as I look around and see the nodding heads, I think you probably already are championing everything that I've mentioned. I just did an interview with the Independent Women's Forum, I guess that was last week, where we talked about how to take up some of these issues just specifically. Take that balanced budget, for example. Every woman knows this. It starts at the kitchen table. Many women are the CFOs of your family and make the child care decisions, the school decisions, the purchasing decisions. But women too often get put in that box, and their roles become defined by what the media or what others think they know women want. My story is a little different. When I took the job working at GoPac, I think I mentioned I was pregnant. I had I had my son, and my daughter was just being born during that election campaign. When we took over the House in 1994, that election night, and Newt became Speaker, my husband quit his job so that I could go move into the Speaker's office and work crazy hours. He raised our kids. He started a business from home, and it took him about 5 or 6 years to do that, but he was at home. So I have the real fortunate, unique perspective of someone who knows what a true partnership is, and it really, really worked out. It doesn't have to be that way. Women are natural leaders, natural planners. My staff always laughs at me because I do everything by the calendar. If you have a goal, what day are you going to do it? And then back up and do everything, as you set up to it. It's a really important way, and I think Newt probably taught us that. Vision, strategies, projects, tactics. Vision, strategies, projects, tactics. Think about everything you do in that matrix, and believe me, you will really crystallize and become more strategic in the way you look at issues. I feel so strongly about women getting out there and running for office that, in fact, as a result of my attending the event last week and thinking about speaking before you today, ALEC is announcing right now, breaking news, that we're going to be starting up a women's legislative caucus. And we have, of the 7,000 state legislators across the country, there are 1,780 or so women legislators of those 7,000. 256 of those are ALEC members. I'm pledging right here that I'm going to grow that number by 100 by the end of the year. UPS already has stepped up to host a Women Legislators Caucus reception at our annual meeting out in San Diego this July. So I'm very excited about that. And that's not just Republican women. I will be reaching out to Democrat women as well, conservative Democrats who agree limited government, free markets, and federalism, which are the principles of ALEC. So hopefully we'll find some. I've laid out 8 goals. The goal setting should not be limited to just those 8. Those are just kind of a guideline for all of you in the policy world. Today's economic problems can be solved by practical, thoughtful solutions. They take hard work and that plan of action that I talked about. You need to be result-oriented, and you need to be able to kind of measure your metrics. At ALEC, we are working really hard to align those and develop those model policies that actually support everything that I've talked about here. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there's time.
What a terrific agenda ALEC has. That's really great, and the work you're doing on the women.
Yeah.
Yay.
Isn't that
Bravo.
fun? I know, so
Yeah.
join up.
Definitely. We have a couple of mics here. If you wouldn't mind giving your name and affiliation so we can get it on the tape and people can know who you are. Let me ask first.
Okay.
We all have our favorite issues. I know I do. I'm just interested, you personally, what's your favorite issue you'd like to get to a podium and talk about?
So I'll cheat a little bit. Actually, my favorite issue is politics. So that's what I got into this for. I find myself at a policy organization driving policy. I am much more driven on the fiscal issues. I've always been I had a piece of paper. I worked at the RNC after the Reagan campaign. I worked for Frank Fahrenkopf, who was the chairman of the RNC. Probably have never heard of him, but he was a big muckety-muck back then. But I had a little thing on my desk that was free trade, free enterprise, limited government. And it was all about the fiscal policies and the efficiencies of government. I think that's what motivates me the most. Having worked at National Review, of course, you get into some of the social issues, but I really have always been motivated by the things that Ronald Reagan talked about, which is, kind of that shining city on a hill and making sure that the United States of America is always kind of that aspiration for other countries to follow.
Great. Okay, if you'd raise your hand, and then I'll let you call on people.
Sure. Any questions? Come on. The water's warm. Jump in. Yes. Hopefully I'll be able to answer.
Laura Truman with the Heritage Foundation.
Hi, Laura.
Just wanted to ask how you understand what seems to be such a dichotomy that so many state legislators are conservative and now flipping towards Republican, but you have a liberal president and you have national politics that, although we had a good election the last time, there are still plenty of reason to be concerned. So it seems like there's 2 stories going on, and I wondered how you reconciled those.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and having come here in the 80s when it was exactly the opposite. The Republicans had the luxury of having the White House for the first, I want to say, almost 16 years that I lived in Washington, and we didn't have the majority. It wasn't until 1994, as I talked about. I think, I don't know if that's gonna hold, because the Democrats really have had a kind of, not a monopoly, but they certainly have for the last 8 years and during the Clinton administrations have kind of controlled the administration and the White House for at least the last 2 decades, with short stints from, well, I guess Bush was 8 years as well, but it does feel like the Democrats have had that national agenda. I think some of that is about how we communicate with issues and how we're perceived, and the optics from the media. I think that as you get closer to government at home. You know your elected official, you trust your elected official, and the media has almost less of a role there. So it's no surprise that the voting actually, kind of follows with what the country really wants. I do think that we are a center-right country right now, still. And I think we're struggling with, and when you think about the language that's used around hope and moving forward, well, everyone has hope for our country, and everyone wants to move forward. So there's a empathy or a sympathy for some of those nationalized messages, but then you see at the grassroots, these guys are really cutting taxes. These guys are really making it better. They're being responsive. They're more accountable. So I think that it's not fair to blame it all on the media. I think some of our or the Republican elected officials have not really communicated as well as they could have on some of those issues. So thinking through as we're now kind of turning the corner into a 2016 national discussion, making sure that the candidates that the Republicans put out there are a little more compassionate, have a little more, tolerance is kind of an overused word, but if they can communicate about the issues in a way that shows that we care about people, like education, like overcriminalization, some of those issues are things that I would really stress. Right here in front.
I'm Nina Whitfield with the Ladies of Liberty Alliance. Thank you for your talk. I liked, you said you think you learned it from Newt, the goals, strategies, tactics. So I wondered what the goal was for the Women's Legislative Caucus.
So it's vision, I saw some of you taking notes, it's great, because I love it when people write these things down, but vision, strategies, tactics, now I've blown it. Vision, strategies, yeah. Vision, strategies, projects, tactics. It's like ingrained into my brain. So the vision is to increase women running for office. It's not just at the state legislative level, it's increasing women running for office across the board. Where I can help, and the strategy that Alec will help deploy is to have a project that would increase our women legislators by our members in ALEC by 100 this year. And then in 16, we're not a political organization, but we'll clearly be working with the other organizations that can have political goals to see if we can't get more women to actually run for office. Any other questions in the back?
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Kate, and I'm interning at the President's Office here at Heritage. I was just wondering if you could shed light on Alec's communication strategy for these big 8 ideas, because I think they're so important for conservative women to grab onto, and that effective messaging is really important.
Yes, it is. I am fortunate to have an amazing communications team. Molly Fuse is sitting right here in the front row, so she's the one who worked on this speech. Our communications team is led by a guy named Bill Meyerling, and we just finished building out kind of a capacity building communications plan for 15 and 16. I think there's a couple of things. There's the tactics and the projects, which are all around social media and making sure that we are visible and recognized and understood by the people in this room and the people in this town and across the states. ALEC is a unique organization. Michelle and I were talking about this earlier. We're under attack. I think the Heritage Foundation is also under attack, but maybe not as much as we are, because there are groups that just have their goal in life is to try to shut us down. So communication strategy is really important. Part of that is to kind of do things like this. Come out, be visible, be present and accounted for, explain who we are, talk about the fact that we are nonpartisan. We actually used to alternate our national chairman, Republican and Democrat, every other year. Nobody would believe that, because 4 years ago, I think, the Democrat leadership in the states told their legislators, you can't join ALEC, and if you do, you'll be stripped of your committee slots. So, that's a tough thing to go up against. So, we try to protect those legislators that are members as much as possible. But back to the communication strategy, I think number one is to be present and accounted for and say yes and take the cookies when they're passed for speaking engagements and things like that. From a social media perspective, making sure that that number one, that our website is accurate and up to date, but also using blogs. All of our policy task force directors blog out on each one of those 8 areas that I talked about, and on a recurring basis, we have goals and metrics that we want them to be out there in the states. I think additionally, as we build out our strategy for the year, making sure that we have kind of two-pronged. One that's a DC-based strategy because policy debates are here, but also, on almost more importantly, is that state strategy. So we're working, I don't know how many how many articles we've had in the states already this year. I mean, 20-30 already in the month of January, December and January. So we're plugging our policy experts out in the states on a regular basis. So if you're in Iowa, you're seeing that article either by Linda Uppmeyer, who's the majority leader and ALEC board member, or it's by, whatever the industry representative is in that state.
Well,
Okay, one more.
one more, last one.
One more? But I know everyone's hungry.
Thank you for speaking today. I'm Ashley Carter. I'm with the Independent Women's Forum. And I wanted to say, thank you for mentioning Frank. He's a fantastic lawyer, and I'm probably one of the few who probably know him in this room. But my question for you, since your personal interest is politics, as a conservative woman, and your message strategy in going with that, what is your, looking to 2016 with Hillary Clinton and her prospect of running for office, what is your message and how would you combat the liberal message to put us in a box? And what would you say to other women who are thinking about potentially voting for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman?
Yeah, well, that's a big, long conversation, but a really important one because I think it kind of sums up, what we're all looking at. And I think it is 51% of the voters are women. So it matters, right? It really matters. I think that 2014 with the race in Colorado and even the congressional race here across the way, Barbara Comstock, I think that kind of war on women mantra that we saw in 2012 and we're all just shocked by, I mean, it was just so relentless and so offensive to women. I think that they learned that that's not going to work this time, and that if you shut it down quickly and very kind of assertively, like Barbara did in her race, I think her opponent, Jerry Connolly, said she's never had a real job. She was just a staffer on the Hill. Well, this is a woman who is a lawyer, was a partner in a law firm, was the head of policy at the RNC. She worked at the Department of Justice, and then, then was a state legislator, and she also raised 2 children, is a grandmother, all the above. And when he said it, he thought probably he'd be able to get away with it because political operative was kind of how he was going to try to position her. She immediately responded back and said, "Are you kidding me?" Just kind of a slam down. And I think that that's a really important lesson to be learned. That if you take no prisoners in terms of how you respond, that everyone's going to say, "Oh yeah, that is right and that is accurate, and how dare he say that?" And even men, I think even men saw that debate, and within a week it was over, and Jerry Connolly's numbers just kind of kept sinking. Colorado, same thing. I think Udall ended up, kind of overstepping his knowledge of issues and overstepping just the use of language and the use of, women's rights. And Cory Gardner kind of called him on that. So As it relates to Hillary Clinton, and I hope it's not an issue. I hope we have women on the ticket, or I know that we're going to have women that are running. I see Carly Fiorina out there. I saw Michelle Bachmann back in 2012. There's Governor Martinez. There's a lot of women out there that are kind of, raising their hand to say, I can be a part of this dialogue. So it's going to be really important for those women to stay strong. Carly Fiorina, for one, she gave a speech at the ALEC meeting last August, and kind of unabashedly pro-life, spoke for 15 minutes on her pro-life positions, which I thought was interesting. She didn't need to, but she kind of was out there and put it up front. I think she did the same thing in Iowa, and she's planning on speaking at CPAC. So, that's going to change, I think, the debate a little bit too. I think for Hillary Clinton's sake, she doesn't want this to be about being a woman candidate either. I think she probably says, well, I've done a lot in my life, and it's not just because I'm a woman that I should get elected. So for her sake, she's going to want to rest on her and run on her accomplishments and her achievements rather than the fact that she could be the first woman president. I would love to see a woman on the ticket at the top or at the bottom. It doesn't matter. I would just love to see it on the Republican side. I think we have a lot of, I'm putting my Republican hat on now. We have a lot of women who should be considered and should throw their hat in the ring. Remember that stat about having to be asked 12 times. So don't ask once and have them turn you down and then move on to the next one. If you look at, I think Jeb Bush just was in town a week ago, and there was an article about his campaign manager, his chief of staff, his political advisor, and 2 other people are all women. The whole campaign is women. So I think that there's a recognition of, and it's, to quote the now famous binders full of women thing, I think that there are a lot of women in politics who have really made a difference, and so there's going to be a lot of resources there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Some gifts for you here. We love ALEC. We're delighted that you're heading it, and we're just looking forward to working with you.
Good.
I have.
5 months in.
5 months in, yeah,
Yes,
you're still a
yes.
baby.
I
New kid.
know,
You can
I
make
know.
mistakes, no problem.
It's still my honeymoon period.
This is our limited edition,
Oh,
Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute coffee mug with her famous saying.
No good deed goes unpunished.
There you
I
go.
love it. I
And
love it. Thank you.
a Clare Boothe Luce tote bag, so you can put all your gifts in it.
Great. Thank you so much.
And from the Heritage Foundation, we have our 2nd edition of the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, which still does contain the 10th Amendment.
Yay. Yay. We
And,
like that.
So we'll give you that, and thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you.